All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Part 8A live podcast from Mencavi News. And this is Miko Santos. On today episode, we're talking to one of the biggest happening in the Middle East. That's Israel or cabinet already ratified the Israel-Hamas deal. So for today's episode, we're talking to Dr. Tahani Mustafa. He, she is a visiting fellow in the Middle East and North African program at the European Council of Foreign Relations. So Mustafa works on issues including security and socio-political and legal governance in the West Bank. Prior, she was a senior Palestine analyst at the International Crisis Group. So please welcome to the show, Dr. Tahani Mustafa. Hello, how are you today?
Thank you. I'm well, thanks.
Thank you for your time. So the first question I have to you is we're now seeing the first phase of the ceasefire take effect. What is your immediate assessment? Is this different from previous agreement that have collapsed, or are we seeing a familiar pattern already?
I think it's more the latter. I think definitely a familiar pattern. There is really no substantial difference here. I think as much as many want to be optimistic and assume that the climate is different, it's very difficult to really substantiate those claims. What we have seen is the same in terms of the negotiations itself, the ceasefire talks, the same sticking points that have not been resolved or really fully ironed out. In some instances, a lot of things have been either deliberately kept or withheld from the public. In many other ways, the ceasefire agreement itself has been made incredibly ambiguous in order to give Israel a lot of leeway. We've seen that in previous ceasefires as well, where the language becomes so ambiguous that often it's been used by Israel to then use as a pretext to go back to open warfare, as well as the fact that there's been absolutely no serious guarantees that Israel is going to act in good faith and actually abide by the terms that have been agreed upon. And that's in terms of just the more immediate issues like withdrawal and hostage handover, as well as the longer term issues like who's going to run Gaza, and Hamas's disarmament. So, I mean, as we can see already, I think there is a lot of concern that, this, in terms of the hostage handover, this time round, we've seen a much shorter time frame given to Hamas to hand over all hostages. So we're looking at a matter of days now, whereby, phase one could potentially collapse once Israel gets everything it wants. There's been no guarantees that Israel is going to not rearrest those Palestinians that have been released, which we've seen in the past. And what's often worse is that the numbers that they release, they often tend to make up through new arrests, especially in the West Bank. The other issue is the fact that Hamas itself has been strong-armed into agreeing to terms that are less than favorable to both the movement but also Gaza, strong-armed by both regional states where it's been pressured to accept the terms of the agreement, as well as the US that offered it an ultimatum, which is either face annihilation or enter into a less than ideal scenario. We've also seen that the US itself, we're not, incredibly optimistic about the seriousness of Trump's pursuit here. He made no secret of the fact that for him, trying to strike a deal in Gaza is more of a vanity project for his pursuit for the Nobel Peace Prize. Now that we've seen that he obviously hasn't won that, interest could very quickly wane, especially once Israel gets what it wants, which is its hostages. For the Israelis, again, there's been a lot of chatter around the fact that Israel, from the outset was not really serious. This was more of a PR exercise for Israel to both dodge accountability for what it's done, but also more importantly to sort of, save face in light of the fact that its reputation has seen a significant decline, especially over the last year. So this has been a real face-saving PR exercise for Israel. And as soon as they get what they want, there's been really no circumstantial evidence to demonstrate Israel's seriousness in these talks. Really.
Mhm. So we also hearing that hostages could be released as early as this weekend, but these are report Hamas hasn't been able to locate all of them. What does that tell you about Hamas' current operational capacity and control within Gaza?
Well, I mean, it doesn't really speak so much to Hamas's control. I think it's more just the practicality. So, I mean, firstly, Hamas wasn't the only faction to have breached the barrier on the 7th of October. So there were other groups that had taken hostages that day, and other factions. Now, that's been an issue since the 7th of October, where Hamas has not been able to effectively communicate or allocate where all hostages are being currently held, simply because they don't have the actual space to do so. Israel is literally bombarding Gaza through both land, air, and sea. So it's been, completely impractical for them to be able to actually gather all the hostages together to significantly allocate any concrete numbers. And Israel has really not done anything to sort of assist in that process. So right now, that is part of the deal now, is that Hamas is being given a momentary sort of pause in order to be able to allocate all remaining hostages and hand them over.
So once the hostages is already hung over to the Israel, let's what's gonna be happening for what you know about how these agreements work? How much weight do those kinds of guarantees actually carry once we give all the hostages?
Well, I mean, so I think that's been a really substantial sticking point here, as it has been with previous agreements, in that Hamas themselves are not under any pretense that this is really going to hold after phase one. But they're also sort of, I think they've also understood now that the hostages are not the kind of playing card they thought they would be. If anything, they've actually empowered Israel to continue to do what it's done in Gaza. But in
Mhm.
terms of regional guarantees, I mean, look, there's been no real substantive pressure from any of these regional states, despite their public posturing. And I think that's where we need to be really mindful of the fact that public posturing is not the same as tangible, serious pressure, right? If you look at any regional state, not a single one of them have leveraged their normalization or peace deals with Israel to try and end what the onslaught that's been happening. Not a single state has recalled any of their ambassadors, even just a symbolic gesture like that. Not a single state has severed economic security and political ties with Israel. And I think worse yet, even though we've seen states like the UAE come out and say things like annexation are a red line, behind the scenes they're actually saying something completely different. And the same with the Saudis, the same with most other, potential power brokers here. In the context of, I guess, the broader international community, Israel's Western allies, the same thing. The EU, the largest trading partner with Israel, has refused to put any kind of substantive pressure on Israel. We're not even talking about just partial suspension of its trade agreement, the EU being the largest trading partner for Israel. Even that they haven't considered once in the last 2 years. Never mind the fact that in January, when Israel had unilaterally broke the agreement, and worse yet, then used starvation as a weapon of war, the EU issued a damning statement against Hamas, blaming them for for forcing Israel's hand to use starvation, right? The absolute moral outrage of that. And then the US, again, we've seen time and time again that the US is not a neutral broker in this conflict. And Trump has made absolutely no secret of the fact that attaining any kind of momentary pause or a cessation of hostilities really has nothing to do with ending the suffering on the ground, and everything to do with the fact that for him it's a form of transaction, right? He's after a particular prize, which he didn't win. And now his attention could very much wane, his interest could wane, it could shift elsewhere. But there's been no indication that he's actually put any red lines for Israel here, or that there will be any significant red lines if Israel does try to use any kind of pretext to return back to open warfare.
So there is a proposed technocratic council to govern Gaza. You've studied governance structure in Palestinian territories extensively. What are the realistic chances this actually works?
I mean, look, it's not a matter of whether it works or not. I think there's been a lot of innovative technocratic solutions coming to, when it comes to governance in the occupied territories. That's really not the issue here. The issue is more politics, right? It's the kind of governing structures that Israel will and won't allow for, and it's the kind of governing structures that Israel's allies end up then supporting. In this case, this idea of a technocratic governing body in Gaza has been something that Israel's allies have floated around. But to be very mindful here, it is a deeply and inherently political project. It is meant to be a very depoliticized technocratic body that is answerable not to the people on the ground, but to an international set of brokers, whether that's the US, the Europeans, but ultimately doing the bidding of Israel, ensuring that this body is able to provide a very modicum level of services, education, potentially sanitation, health, but nothing in the way of serious security for Palestinians, more in the service of Israel, ensuring that Palestinians are disarmed, that they can't pose a threat to Israel. It really has nothing to do with enforcing law and order on the ground in the occupied territories. And worse yet, a lot of the more substantive sort of issues when it comes to things like who can and can't represent Palestinians are going to be determined by the international community, by Israel and its Western allies, actually. Even when it comes to the composition of this technocratic government, those will be selected not by Palestinians, but by people like Trump, people like Netanyahu, which is really, deeply, politically and morally problematic, right? But worse yet, what it also ends up leading to is a separation of the occupied territory. So you can no longer talk about a contiguous Palestinian state when you've got two separate administrations, one in Gaza that is already territorially cut off from the West Bank, and then one in the West Bank, right, under the Palestinian Authority. And that's been the international community's envisionment of this technocratic government. Now, Israel itself has objected time and time again. It does not want neither a technocratic government nor the PA, certainly not Hamas, which is really irrelevant considering Hamas have already said that they want no role to play in government. They've signed agreements to the effect with other Palestinians, and those agreements have been brokered and assured by regional states like Egypt that they will have no part to play in government. But in any case, Israel is continuously parroting this idea that they don't want to see any kind of entity that can ever bring Gaza to a point where Gaza can ever threaten Israel's sense of security again.
Thank you for that, Tahani. What struck me listening to the various reaction is how much the Arab states have united behind this plan. That feels significant. Are we seeing a genuine realignment in the region?
No, look, I think this plan. There is nothing good in this plan that comes out for Palestinians. This plan works more in favor than Israel than it does for the Palestinians, because this plan does not guarantee full Israeli withdrawal. This plan does not ensure that Israel will not be in control of Gaza through its land, air, and sea space as it has pre-7th of October. This plan does not guarantee that there will ever be an independent Palestinian state, a contiguous Palestinian state, a unified Palestinian state. This plan doesn't even guarantee that Palestinians can select those that represent them. So I don't see anywhere in this that there is anything good that comes out of this for Palestinians. And worse yet, this plan denounces the right to resistance from an occupied people by calling for the disarmament of the last vestige of organized armed resistance that they have. Now, Arab states obviously have self-interests involved here. Many of them, in the case of Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, are facing an existential crisis, quite literally, because Israel is, Netanyahu has openly, emboldeningly stated that he's on some kind of messianic vision of expanding Israel's territories and borders into Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and even now potentially Saudi Arabia. So Israel is adamant on redrawing the maps regionally. So for them, there is an existential crisis, an existential threat, which is, significantly affecting their own national interest here in terms of their survival, but also domestically, where these states have, for the last 2 years, especially in the case of Jordan, ensured that there is no activism around the issue of Palestine. And if it is very heavily censored around what works for the state, and where prison has become a revolving door for the majority of those that are active around the issue of Palestine. Again, they're not threatening the regime in any capacity, but just openly, state calling for Palestinian rights, Palestinian statehood, supporting the concept of Palestinian resistance has been enough. Even those that have just been involved in the charity side of things has been enough to draw them into the sort of purview of the state. So I don't. This is not a realignment. This is really just regional states acting out of self-interest. GCC states themselves now know that they are not immune from having their sovereignty violated by Israel, as we saw with Qatar. Saudi Arabia is still seething off the fact that Israel has managed to derail a normalization deal, not because they want normalization with Israel per se, but it has everything to do with the fact with what they could actually be getting from the states out of this. But still, Israel has made it impossible to actually pursue that normalization deal that Saudi is so adamant on pursuing. Because right now you've got, again, there's a disconnect between where these regimes want to go and the sentiment on the ground amongst the publics. Right. So the time is now not apt for normalization, especially if Israel continues to behave the way that it does. So I think it's in everyone's interest now to see quiet, to see stabilization. Not just because, obviously, of the discontent that it's brewing at home, leaving these regimes in a very precarious situation, especially in terms of their legitimacy, but also because Israel is just hell-bent on driving the entire region into some kind of regional war, just plunging it in. In the last 2 years, it has attacked not just its neighbors, but, we've seen that it has tried to draw the world into a regional war with states like Iran, for instance.
Mhm. So let's go back, Tahani, on West Bank. If this deals holds in Gaza, what does that means for the West Bank? Does it create momentum, or could it actually make things more complicated there?
I mean, look, this deal will make things complicated regardless. I mean, the deal itself, I mean, just in terms of, if you just look at what it's offering for Gaza, is a very complex. It's a very complex agreement. Now, in terms of what this could mean for the West Bank, I think the distraction of Gaza has served Israel very well for its objectives in the West Bank, because that really is where Israel's sort of territorial ambitions lie historically and now more so. And where we've seen Israel accelerate a lot of those, the pursuit of those objectives, where we've seen the largest land grab since the Oslo Accords, where we've seen the largest displacement of Palestinians since the 1967 war, when Israel annexed the West Bank from Jordan. We've seen some of the largest fatalities since the Second Intifada, just in the West Bank alone, where Israel has also conducted mass arrest campaigns, which is kind of goes back to the point I made earlier. There's no guarantee that Israel, the numbers that it ends up releasing are not going to be made up by new arrests. We've seen something like 14,000 Palestinians arrested since the 7th of October, and over 10,000 of those have come from the West Bank. So Israel, I think whenever we tend to see any kind of reprieve afforded to Gaza, that's often come at a cost. In January, we saw the cost coming at the expense of the West Bank, where we saw Israel launch Operation Iron Wall, one of the most lethal military operations the West Bank has seen in quite a while, that led to the displacement of 40,000 people and literally the indiscriminate killing of women, children, and men. In those neighborhoods, and Israeli far-right ministers making good on their promise to turn certain localities in the West Bank into mini Gazas. Now, I think the Israeli pretext at the time was that, they were clamping down on things like armed resistance. But I think you really need to consider, why is there why have younger generations been pushed to armed resistance when for the longest time Palestinians had renounced that, right? They had sort of very much renounced that as a means towards self-determination. And then the second issue was the fact that the PA, the Palestinian Authority, had successfully brokered a amnesty deal with a lot of those militants, putting them in prison in exchange for laying down their arms, which was not good enough for Israel at the time. And this is to quote, a Western military official who's been working closely between both the IDF and the Palestinian Authority, that at that time Israel didn't want to see militants in prison; they wanted them dead.
Mhm. So, U.S. President Donald Trump the current news right now that he is coming on Monday and also bringing at least 200 US soldier in on the region. And he's also talking about Council of Peace. You study international involvement in Palestinian governance. What's the track record of this kind of international frameworks?
I mean, okay, I don't even think you have to look internationally, just look at the context of Palestine historically, or just the region historically, right? The US is not a neutral arbiter in this conflict. They've made no pretense of that. Trump's administration has made no pretense as to where its political leanings lie. So I think just off the bat, many are already very skeptical about the fact that he's bringing 200 US soldiers with him. Though that is not a substitute for an international observer force that can, monitor the situation on the ground and ensure the agreement is being fulfilled, right? Especially when you're having the one state that has literally been the biggest impediment to any kind of international attempt to try and deter what has happened in Gaza and to try and broker some kind of ceasefire. So that I think that's first of all the board of peace idea. I mean, I think many people have kind of drawn parallels between like the mandate system, which was basically a refashioned form of modern day colonialism back in the 20s. I mean, you can call it whatever you want. I think ultimately at the substance of it, you don't have to look very far. Never mind, all of the kind of duties that it has assigned itself, by the way, including, and this is if they really do draw influence from one of the plans that influence this, taking on diplomatic duties on behalf of the Palestinians, which is just absolutely insane, given that Palestinians still have the PLO, which is meant to be the legal representative of all Palestinians globally. It's internationally recognized as such and domestically amongst Palestinians. But I think more importantly, just look at the very people that will be running it, right? And I think one of the most contentious figures has been Tony Blair. Now, I think a lot of people tend to draw on his legacy, obviously in the region, which is horrendous, the Iraq War. But even his legacy in Palestine has been horrendous. When he was head of the quartet, this was at a time where the quartet had basically enforced an international embargo against against a democratically elected government, if not the first time in the region's history where we saw an opposition party become government. And their first recourse was to enforce an international embargo and enforce a bunch of conditions that they knew would set up the movement to failure. And since then, you've had states that were very much party to that regret that course of action. I think in hindsight, many of these states have openly come out and regretted that course of action, realizing that actually it had the adverse effect. It didn't end up producing the results that they thought it would, which was to isolate Hamas. It ended up actually, instilling the kind of status quo that we've had that's brought us to this point, to this current predicament. Worse yet, when Tony Blair was head of the quartet, you can just pinpoint certain examples when, he was the kind of his thinking when it came to governance, Palestinian governance, just on a very technocratic level here. He was someone that would insist on diverting funds for education, which is what the Ministry of Interior was trying to push for at the time, towards building, quote, more prisons in order to put more prisoners, anticipated prisoners, might I add. This was after the Second Intifada. So that's the kind of man that people think, and again, politics aside, but just that one example of his technocratic prowess, right, is the kind of man that they think is going to be the one that is the most competent to be able to enforce effective governance in the context of Gaza.
That's a very interesting scenario. So, Dr. Tahani, we heard warnings about splinter groups and potential spoilers who might use violence to derail this process. What should we be watching for in the coming weeks, and what are the early warning signs in this falling apart?
I mean, look, I think I think the biggest sort of focal point needs to be Israel, right? Because that is what has ended up derailing the previous pauses, let's say, whether that's November 2023, January 2025, or even just generally where we've had ceasefire talks going on, and where Israel has managed to find a way to torpedo those at every turn. So, I think it's not so much about spoiler groups, more like spoiler states. you know, and I think it's really difficult to sort of pinpoint what it could be, because Israel has literally latched on to any pretense in order to unilaterally break a ceasefire. And it really doesn't have to latch on to much, especially given that there's really no serious international pressure to rein it in. And as I gave the example of the January 2025 as a really good example of that. I mean, Israel really couldn't find anything during that first phase that could have been a legitimate excuse to have ended it sooner. It was really when they got into phase two that Israel then decided to unilaterally just break it, right? But in that entire, I think, month that it lasted through, it was very difficult for Israel to latch onto anything, because there really hadn't been any serious violation from Hamas's part. Israel, on the other hand, committed something like 962 violations, as well as rescinded and redrew a lot of the borders where it was supposed to withdraw. So I think really, our eyes need to be on Israeli actions on the ground. And really seeing what happens past Monday, which is really the cutoff date for when Hamas has to hand over all the hostages.
Dr. Tahani Mustafa of European Council of Foreign Relations, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. That's another episode of Part 8A. And see you again next week. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you again for having me.
Okay, give me a second.